Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we are embarking on a seriously fascinating journey to explore a completely alternative framework for human history. We're going to drill down deep into the archaeology and anthropology of our past, tracing early humanity all the way from the Garden of Eden to our current global dispersion. We'll be looking at all of this through the lens of the Unified Theory of Geologic History, or UTGH. This is a model that really challenges standard timelines, offering a radically different perspective on the Earth beneath our feet and the history written right inside our DNA.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the two timelines, finding the lost Eden, surviving the rupture, the Neanderthal puzzle, rebuilding from memory, and finally, the Great Scattering.
Section 1. The two timelines.
To really wrap our heads around the archaeological and anthropological evidence we're going to unpack, we first need to look at it through two very different lenses. Now, what's absolutely vital to grasp here is that both frameworks are looking at the exact same rocks, the exact same ruins, and the exact same human bones, but they interpret time and mechanisms radically differently. The standard model, uniformitarianism, relies on millions of years of gradual evolution and super slow geographic changes. On the flip side, the UTGH framework proposes a recent global catastrophe that happened roughly 5,300 years ago, followed by extremely rapid biological and geological changes.
So let's look at the standard model, uniformitarianism, which is basically the bedrock of modern Earth science. It operates on this core principle that the present is the key to the past. It posits that Earth's current features and humanity's development occurred through the slow, gradual processes that we can still observe happening today, stretching over deep, deep time.
But then, in stark contrast, the UTGH framework views the Earth's surface through the lens of a massive, super recent disruption. It actually doesn't argue that the planet itself is young, but rather that a single, intensely violent rupture event reshaped the surface of an already ancient Earth in literally a matter of days. It's a catastrophist perspective that drastically compresses the timeline of human development.
Section 2. Finding the Lost Eden.
All right, let's shift gears and transition geographically to the pre-flood world. If we follow the UTGH model, where exactly did humanity begin? Where was the Garden of Eden? Well, the framework proposes that Eden wasn't in modern-day Iraq like many think, but rather it was the pre-flood Mediterranean basin, which used to be a lush, low-lying valley. According to this framework, when the global rupture happened, the Atlantic Ocean violently breached the land bridge at Gibraltar. This blasted water eastward, catastrophically scouring the entire Mediterranean valley, picking up all its soil and vegetation, and washing it straight into the subsiding Arabian basin. And this brilliantly illustrates a truly mind-blowing conclusion under the UTGH model. That immense volume of organic material, the lush vegetation and thick forests of the lost Eden, was buried under massive amounts of flood sediment over in Arabia. Over the following millennia, that compressed biomass became the petroleum we extract today. Meaning, in this view, the world's largest oil fields are the literal physical remains of the Garden of Eden. Pretty wild to think about, right?
Section 3. Surviving the rupture.
Let's push the narrative forward a bit. The destruction of this pre-flood world created a catastrophic bottleneck that forever changed the trajectory of human history. UTGH posits that the catastrophe was triggered by the rupture of a high-pressure subterranean ocean, which led to global inundation and massive violent tectonic plate movement. But what about the people? How did anyone make it? Well, the model claims survivors made it through in two distinct ways. Some existed on a vessel, representing Noah's lineage, while others were actually trapped, surviving in total isolation up in the highest continental interiors, as far away from the initial rupture point as physically possible.
Section 4. The Neanderthal puzzle.
Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how it makes a highly surprising anthropological claim to address a long-standing puzzle. UTGH completely reclassifies Neanderthals. Instead of viewing them as a separate extinct evolutionary branch of hominids, UTGH proposes they were simply an isolated human lineage. Specifically, the framework maps them to the descendants of Cain who were isolated in those pre-flood rocky highlands we just talked about. Over generations, that extreme isolation and harsh environment brought out specific latent cold climate physical traits.
So what happened to them? Well, the framework argues that as the floodwaters eventually receded, these isolated highland survivors came back into contact with the descendants of the Ark. The genetic signal that mainstream science calls Neanderthal DNA is, in this model, just the genomic reintegration, a family reunion, essentially, of separated human families in the post-flood world.
Section 5. Rebuilding from memory.
Let's shift our focus over to the archaeological record, specifically the sudden and super mysterious rise of early, complex cities right after this proposed bottleneck. Here we find a genuine archaeological anomaly. The site of Göbekli Tepe features these massive 20-ton carved stone pillars. Now, standard dating places it at 11,500 years old, meaning it was supposedly built by hunter-gatherers long before the invention of agriculture or even the wheel. The standard model really struggles to explain how a society could possibly feed and organize the immense labor required for such monumental construction without any farming. Well, UTGH provides a pretty unique solution here. These builders absolutely weren't primitive hunter-gatherers slowly discovering things. They were descendants applying blueprints from a lost, highly sophisticated world. They had inherited pre-flood knowledge of architecture and astronomy, meaning they were rebuilding from memory, not starting from scratch. And as for that really old timeline, UTGH argues that the rupture event massively disrupted the Earth's atmospheric carbon ratio, which means uncalibrated radiocarbon dates from the immediate post-flood period appear thousands of years artificially older than they actually are.
So, in partially contrasting how these two lenses try to solve the sudden appearance of civilization, we can look at the Uruk problem, which is the rapid emergence of complex cities in river valleys. The standard model is missing the gradual intermediate evidence for this, whereas UTGH argues it was a simultaneous global rebuild from shared memory. And then for Göbekli Tepe, standard dating sees an impossible hunter-gatherer monument, while UTGH sees a 5,300-year-old post-flood construction relying on those recalibrated carbon dates.
Section 6. The Great Scattering.
Let's move to the final phase of the timeline and see how this builds into the geographic isolation of humanity. UTGH proposes a very precise post-flood timeline. About 531 years after the flood, a period the ancient genealogical texts call the Days of Peleg, the tectonic plates actually finished their rapid separation. Following this, the post-flood ice age began to melt. This massive melt raised global sea levels dramatically, submerging the coastal land bridges that early humans had just crossed, which permanently isolated them on entirely different continents.
200. This is a crucial number. The UTGH framework claims it took only 200 generations for these newly isolated founding populations to express full modern human diversity. Rather than slow, gradual genetic mutation over tens of thousands of years, the model argues for rapid epigenetic activation. This is where extreme environmental pressures essentially turned on latent, pre-existing physical traits that were already packed into the rich, diverse DNA of the survivors.
Think about this for just a second. Anthropologists have cataloged over 270 independent cultures worldwide, from Aboriginal Australians in the Pacific to ancient Babylonians in the Middle East, all the way to indigenous tribes in the Americas, that all share remarkably similar traditions of a global flood, a vessel or high ground survival, and a sudden, rapid repopulation. So the crucial point is how we interpret this immense convergence of cultural memory. The standard approach often leans toward localized floods or shared psychological archetypes. But under the UTGH framework, these identical narrative structures aren't a coincidence, and they definitely aren't independent inventions. They represent literal, shared, inherited history. The descendants carried the exact same memory of the exact same event as they scattered across the globe.
As we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on regarding everything we've looked at. When we see totally disconnected early civilizations building the exact same monuments, using the exact same math, and telling the exact same stories of destruction, did they all coincidentally invent these things from scratch in total isolation? Or, as the UTGH framework suggests, are we simply reading the scattered, surviving chapters of a highly advanced human story that was already written long before the flood? It definitely changes how you look at the earth beneath your feet. Thanks for joining me today.